Bonjour, Mayagan Gijik Indishnakaz, Mayagan and Dudem. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lorena Fontaine, and I'm the Indigenous Academic Lead at the University of Winnipeg. And I would like to welcome everyone to this year's first Wewini Lecture Series, Decolonizing Contracts, Transforming Relationships Through Art and Indigenous Perspective. I'm really grateful that we're having this first lecture series partly by Zoom, but also we have a bit of an audience here, so that is a real treat for us here today, for those of us that are here live. I'm going to be giving the land acknowledgement and talking a little bit about the lecture series, and then I'll hand it over to Jennifer Nepinak. The University of Winnipeg is located on the ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. These lands are the heartland of the Métis people. We also acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. The Wewini Lecture Series was established by the Canoe family in the memory of the late Tobasonaquat Canoe. He was a respected Anishinaabe leader and elder and teacher and healer and honorary degree recipient. He was very committed to the University of Winnipeg community, as well as promoting the rich intellectual life of Indigenous peoples. The spirit of the lecture series came from the concept Wewini Sego. It was the way Tobasonaquat used to sign off all his personal correspondence. Wewini alone means be cautious, kind of like a warning. But when you add the word Sego for Wewini Sego, it means take care of yourself and be careful. Tobasonaquat believed that we as Indigenous peoples have to take care of one another in much the same way we have to take care of our cultural identity. Some of you may have heard the saying, if we take care of the language will take care of us. The Wewini Lecture Series was established from that same spirit to take care of, to promote the intellectual life of Indigenous peoples. The lecture series is one way for us to take care of our cultural history, our science, our Indigenous knowledge, to make sure that the intellectual life of Indigenous peoples carries on. With Tobasonaquat's vision in mind, the purpose of the series is to bring the best and the brightest to the University of Winnipeg. And we have so many brilliant Indigenous peoples in our communities, and this series is a way for us to celebrate that brilliance. We would not be able to hold these lecture series without the work of the Wewini Committee. I would like to acknowledge this year's committee, Dr. Mary Jane McCallum, Dr. Jamie Cedro, Dr. Julie Nagum, Dr. Karen Froman, Darren Cushane, and Dr. Julie Nagum. I'd now like to call up Jennifer Nepinak, the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Engagement at the University of Winnipeg. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Lorena. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, anin, animikiajik dijinakas, makwadundem, apchinamanandan magaya nungam. Maneguzi Bidunji, Pine Creek Treaty 4 First Nation is where I come from. As noted by Lorena, I'm the Associate Vice President for Indigenous Engagement here at the University of Winnipeg. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here to the Wewini series today. And particularly my pleasure to welcome Professor Carey Newman, my friend, my colleague, to share some information with you today about decolonizing contracts. I had the great pleasure, just a bit of background, I had the great pleasure of meeting Carey many years ago. Our friendship started when I was working over at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights a few years back. And I had the good fortune of coming across Carey and his work, and through that we developed a relationship and a partnership which inevitably led to some conversation around the witness blanket specifically and and its connection to some of the work we were doing at the museum and how we could work together to support the process going forward. So through the blanket, Carey and I were able to do some really unique processes and systems as it relates to contracts, and I really thought it would be a tremendous idea to have him here to come and speak to that for us here at this lecture series today. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about this, because I think the process that was established is really quite unique. It's really super innovative when we're talking about decolonizing and indigenization within institutions and systems. So I am trusting that this presentation today is going to give you some really unique insight into what that could look like for yourself or for your colleagues or your community or your institutions. So with that, I'm gonna call Carey up and have him introduce himself. Sometimes that's better. I'll have him do that, and then I think it will hold questions towards the end, because then I'll be able to come back up with Carey and share any thoughts or insights I may have and answer any questions I may be able to answer as we go forward. So with that, I say miigwech. Carey?
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for having me here. And I really appreciate the explanation of the origin of this lecture series, and I think that it really sets a nice atmosphere and sets me in a good frame of mind for what I'm about to share. As Jennifer said, my name is Carey Newman. My traditional name is Hyles Kingame. I come from the Kwekwekum, Giksam, and Wawallabai Namima of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, which is on the northern end of Vancouver Island, as well as from Chiam of the Stalo Nation, which is Coast Salish territory along the Upper Fraser Valley. That's through my father. Through my mom, I'm English, Irish, and Scottish settler stock from Saskatchewan. I'm an artist. I'm the inaugural Impact Chair for Indigenous Art Practice at the University of Victoria. And my pathway into academia is one that is largely decolonized. I was homeschooled as a child. My education consisted of learning all of the things that you learn in elementary school and middle school and high school, but they were done in a much more free-form, free-flowing way, where it would include building a tree fort, it would include cooking dinner for the family, it would include different kinds of play, interaction, and eventually it led me to university, but I've yet to complete a degree. So I start with that here because I think that it's important in the context of thinking about what decolonization means. Because the University of Victoria and my colleagues there have shown a great deal of commitment to the principle of decolonization by recognizing both my professional practice as an artist and also the traditional knowledge that I've learned throughout my life. And I think I credit that experience with how I was able to successfully apply for a position there, but also in the way that the university has embraced my way of thinking. And I truly believe that part of the reason that this contract came into being in the way that it is, the one that I'm going to describe to you, is because of my experiences, the way I was educated, and how that's a little bit different from the sort of standard pathway to become educated. I'm going to start with a video to give everybody an idea of what the witness blanket is before I begin to show and talk about the agreement.
Between 1870 and 1996, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent to residential schools. Their identities were stolen, cultures extinguished. They were undernourished, neglected, and often abused. There were more than 4,100 confirmed deaths. Did your school have a graveyard? How could this have happened? Where do we go from here? The Witness Blanket, a national monument to recognize the atrocities of the Indian residential school era.
Strewn in the wake of the Indian residential schools are an immeasurable number of broken or damaged pieces. These fragmented cultures, crumbling buildings, segments of language, and grains of diminished pride are often connected only by the common experience that created them. Imagine those pieces, symbolic and tangible, woven together in the form of a blanket. A blanket made from pieces of residential schools, churches, government buildings, and cultural structures. A blanket where the story of each piece is as important to its construction as the wood and screws that hold it together. A blanket with the sole purpose of standing in eternal witness to the effects of the Indian residential school era. The system created and run by churches and the Canadian government to take the Indian out of the child. Left alone, these pieces may be forgotten, lost, buried, or worse, be uncomfortable reminders that leave painful impressions on the minds and hearts of those who recognize what they represent. Individually, they are paragraphs of a disappearing narrative. Together, they are strong and formidable, collectively able to recount for future generations the true story of loss, strength, reconciliation, and pride.
I made this blanket for the survivors, and for the children who never came home, for the dispossessed, the displaced, and the forgotten. I made this blanket for the parents who hold their stories deep inside, afraid of what confronting them might cause in their hearts, afraid of how the truth will affect their children. It is for those who are angry, those in pain, and for those who are working to find their way through, for those who are bitter, and those who remember, and those who have spent a lifetime trying to forget. To forget the braids that were shorn, the heads that were shaved, the dignity that was stolen, and the beatings, abuse, and violation. I made this blanket so that I will never forget. So that we will never forget. It is for the families who have lost their aunts and uncles and sisters and brothers and mothers and fathers and children. For the ones who left us too soon. We have all lost someone too soon. I made this for the communities that were broken, their future scooped up and sent away, never to be the same. Silence replacing the sound of children's laughter. For the victims of violence and the perpetrators of that same violence, some of whom were never taught a better way. We cannot excuse violence, but if we can understand the root of the matter, we can begin to find solutions. For those like me who didn't realize how deeply we were affected until we tried to speak our traditional languages or sing our traditional songs, who didn't know what we didn't know. For those who found, when they had children of their own, they had to learn how to show them love. I love my daughter, my only child, but I was afraid to have a son for fear that I wouldn't know how to relate to him. That is the way it was for many years between me and my father. It is for those of us who spent part of our lives ashamed of our heritage, for those who have yet to learn how to respect themselves for whom they are and for where they are from. I made this for our cultures, our languages, and our traditions that were legislated away, for the governments and churches who tried to take them, It is for the resilience that grasp to those traditions, sustaining them through generations, so that they are now able to flourish again. I made this for anyone who doesn't know what a residential school is, or the truth of what happened there, or the policies and laws that created them. I made this for those who wonder, when are they going to get over it? So that we can have that discussion in earnest and begin to change those perceptions. I made this blanket for the people who want to learn and those who feel guilt, and for those who walk beside us and those who are just now ready to walk beside us. I made this for the conversations still to come, for the lessons we have yet to learn, and for the future we are building together. I made this blanket for hope. I made it for truth. I made it to catch our tears. I made it for reconciliation. I made it for me, and I made it for each of you. In the traditions of my Salish ancestors, it is meant to uplift our spirits, protect us when we are vulnerable, and to honor good work when it is done. It is for our children, and our children's children, and all the generations to come. It is for my daughter. When I think back and remember, at the very beginning, as I sat and thought about what I could do, through all of my ideas and dreams, through the collection of the pieces and the success and failure of the creative process, most of all, in my heart, my truth is that I made this blanket for my father. We need to honor the survivors and remember the children who were lost. We need to speak openly about these stories to ensure that this never happens again.
So that's the witness blanket. And it went on tour. After it was completed, it went on tour of Canada for about 4.5 years. And one of the stops along the way was the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. That was December of 2015. And in that moment is when I met Jennifer the first time. And seeing the blanket represented amongst the atrocity and genocide from around the world, and seeing residential school history placed amongst those stories, made a really powerful impact on me. And I remembered that. And then when the time came for the tour to end, I reached out to the museum to see if they were interested in having the blanket live there forever, or on a permanent basis. And so they agreed that they wanted to, and that's where the conversation began. And I came and I met with Jennifer and the other members of the senior executive team there to discuss how that would take place. Now, because the blanket is made up of all of these objects and all of these stories that come from across the country, it never felt to me the same way as the other things that I make. I carve totems and make jewelry, and I take one thing and turn it into something else, and I sell it, and then the people who buy it own it. And so it's a trade of goods or property. But because of the material that the witness blanket was made from, I never thought of it in the same way. Because how could I own those stories? How could I profit from those stories? And And I didn't want it to enter into the museum as a piece of property because I felt it as responsibility. And so a couple of teachings that I've grown up with are what went into the agreement that we set out to make. One is honoring the past, recognizing or respecting the present, and taking responsibility for the future. This past, present, future is something that has come up over and over again in the way that my community addresses questions that arise, in the way we stand in ceremony, the way we introduce ourselves, where we talk about who we're connected to, because that's part of our system of accountability. So that's one of them. Another one that is embedded or embodied in this this agreement, the stewardship agreement, is the concept of awitna kyola, which is a Kwakwala word meaning to live in good relationship with the land, air, water, spirit world, and everything in them. And I think a lot about that when I look around the world and we think about the issues that we're facing, and how if we were to embrace this kind of concept, then we might not have rushed forward with the extraction. In BC, we're seeing the devastation from deforestation, and sort of fires followed by flood are magnifying the impact of those things. Now, if we had taken a different approach to forestry, how would that have changed the current reality in the province of British Columbia? Scientists tell us that if there were more forests, then more of that water would have been absorbed, and we wouldn't have had the highways being washed out. But we didn't think about those things. We thought about the profit. We thought about economy. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have those things in consideration, because all of them exist in this agreement. Economy exists in this agreement, but we think about them in a little bit of a different way. So that's the sort of premise of the agreement that Jennifer and me and Heather and others at the Museum for Human Rights crafted together. And we based it in Western law and in Kwakwaka'wakw legal traditions. And it led to partnership, stewardship, and legacy. And it's based in relationship. One of the other things that led to a very key point in the agreement is something that I learned from my own tradition. The mask that's in this image is called the Newman mask. And Newman was my family name before it was anglicized to Newman. And I visited this mask at the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin. And I saw it as you see it now, beautifully lit in a glass case. And I was filled with both like wonder and sorrow at the same time, because I couldn't touch it. I couldn't hold it. I didn't feel like I could be in conversation with it because of this glass around it, because of this sort of museum lighting. And I asked the curator if there was any chance that I could bring the mask home, so that because there's two other versions of this mask. One is at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC, and the other one is in our family box of treasures. And so I had this image of seeing 3 generations of the mask dance together. And after they explained how expensive it would be and how the insurance would cost too much and all of the sort of structural, systematic obstacles, they said, but even if we could address all of those issues, you wouldn't be able to hold it in your hands or hold it to your face, because in the process of conserving it, we treated it with arsenic, and so it's poisonous. And that when I think about how we view our masks as ancestors, as living beings, and that we sing songs to them to put them to sleep before we wrap them in blankets and put them in our box of treasures, and we sing a different song to wake them up. When I heard that they poisoned it, I thought, what did it do to the spirit of this object, to the spirit of my ancestor? And what's happened to the purpose when it can no longer be what it was made to be? So that was an important thing, because all of those objects on the witness blanket have a story. They often came with a story from the survivor or the community that gave them, but they also have their own stories. So in thinking about how to make an agreement around this, we also had to consider the objects themselves, and the agency of those objects, and the agency of those stories. So one of the very first things we did was agree that neither side would trade rights, that we wouldn't negotiate rights, because all rights would exist with the blanket and the stories that it carries. And what that left for us was to negotiate responsibility. And that was kind of the founding principle, I think, of the stewardship agreement, was working our way through the conversation around rights versus responsibility, and recognizing that maybe in this situation, we shouldn't have the rights, right? Maybe we should focus on what the needs are of the blanket and the stories and the purpose of the witness blanket, and we should just accept responsibility for acting in the best interest of those. One of the things in a contract that both parties or all parties are working towards is to mitigate liability, to ensure, to create certainty. And so this doesn't really create certainty, but it does limit liability, because by me not having rights and the museum not having rights, we're forced into a relationship. And we address that in the text of the contract. We talk about how this contract is about being in relationship. And we talk about how to maintain that relationship, that we need to eat food together. We need to do the things that in the Kwakwaka'wakw ways we do to make determinations about social structure decisions, about legal decisions. We have potlatch, and in there we dance, we sing, we speak, we eat, we share, we give gifts, and we are in relationship with one another. And all of those things exist in one place. They're not different disciplines, they're not different departments or faculties, they're all one, because they're inseparable from one another. So in many ways, this agreement is the embodiment of, or draws inspiration from, both Western law and Kwakwaka'wakw legal orders. And the text of the agreement speaks to the relationship. It speaks to our responsibility as past, present, future, and it sets out a graphic that will guide us in fulfilling that responsibility of how to act in the best interest of the blanket. There's a lot of talk in this country, in this world, about reconciliation. There's also a lot of talk about decolonization. And for me, this is one small aspect of decolonization, because it represents a structural change. The relationship between me and the museum is different than it would have been if I sold them a piece of property, because that would have been a transaction that would have been completed as soon as the check cleared. But because I couldn't accept a payment, it changed the conversation. It also represents a transformation in the way that the museum is in relationship with the work itself. It doesn't see the witness blanket as a possession or even just as an object. They see themselves as being in relationship with both the witness blanket and me as the artist. The last bit of this is that we enacted this. You've been seeing all these pictures beside it. Those are the images from the oral ceremony that we held to enact the written contract. I have a belief that the further you get away from a written word, the less clarity you have about what the intention of the person who wrote it down was. And I think that oral traditions do a great job of recognizing and addressing that. Because when we hear and retell stories, we're retelling them in the context of the world that we're in, right? And as we retell the story, it's changing as it necessarily needs to change, so it doesn't become locked in the past. It's responding to the same purpose. And in many ways, that's how our ceremonies function. At the root of a ceremony, we have a purpose. And then that's how we take those ceremonies and lift them up and use them to address things that we face in the world today. Because we find the purpose of the ceremony, and we address many different things through that. So the last, I guess, signatory to the contract is the witnesses who were there. Because at the ceremony, I stood at the front of the room in a big house in ceremony and spoke to my commitments to the museum and to the blanket. And people from the museum stood and spoke about the museum's commitment and their personal commitment to me and to the blanket. And then the witnesses each had a chance to reflect back to us what they had heard and to maybe add their own commitment. So now we have a community who are gathered together around a written contract, but also gathered together around ceremony. And we collectively carry that responsibility to continue to act in the best interest of the blanket. The last part I want to talk about, I think, is the financial component, because when we started to have the conversation and we finally kind of began to make our way through what does a contract look like when it's written, and after the legal team at the museum began to wrap their minds around what we were talking about, and how it actually does address the things that contracts are supposed to address. It just does it from a different angle, because the museum certainly doesn't carry liability, because me not having rights means it's really difficult for me to sue them. And the obligations that are spoken to in the agreement are based in relationship. And so really what we've agreed to is, and what the contract, if it were ever to say be tested in a court, speaks to, is go and be in relationship together and sort this out. And we've created a pathway of how that responsibility looks. But for the financial component, what I asked for was for the museum to reinvest into the blanket the same amount of money that residential school survivors put into creating the work in the first place. The witness blanket was funded through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but the money for it was set aside in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So that's residential school survivors taking money from their victory in their class action case and saying commemoration is important, memory is important, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to commit money to ensure that that happens. The total amount was a teeny little bit over $1 million when you include the tour, and so that was the request, that the museum reinvest into the project that amount. So what that has turned into is, if you go to the museum now, the witness blanket is on exhibit, but it's going through a public process of conservation. The public process of conservation is taking up those things that I learned from the Newly's mask that's in the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin, where we're thinking about what the purpose of each of those objects is, and making sure that whatever we are doing to extend its life is in alignment with what that purpose is. So for instance, there's medicine on the blanket, and I believe that if we were to put any kind of acrylic, any kind of adhesive onto the medicine, then it would cease to be medicine, in the same way that that mask is no longer a mask that can be danced. And so if the day arrives when the medicine can no longer hold itself together in the exhibit, then we need to burn it in the way that it was intended and replace it with new medicine, so that the new medicine can continue to do the work that the current medicine is doing. And as we go across the blanket and look at the different kinds of objects and the different things that they're made from and the different places that they came from, we think about how do we act in the best interest of this object and that object. And how do we make sure that each of them maintain their purpose? So that's something that is being facilitated through this agreement, because the resources to carry this out are provided for in that reinvestment into the blanket. We also made the full documentary available, because we kind of built it with by incurring debt. Partnership, a wonderful partnership with the folks at Media One in Victoria who filmed it without payment, and then we were able to make it freely available through this agreement. We are also working on some digital projects where there's a digital storytelling project called the Digital Witness Blanket that lifts up, we have 160 hours of video from the process of gathering the pieces, making the blanket, and maybe most importantly, speaking with survivors and walking through residential schools, many of which don't exist anymore. So this digital storytelling project will be able to share more of those stories, more of those voices. We're working on a virtual reality project where we're making a virtual blanket. And on this visit here, I brought a team together who are going to design a digital sound design, so that when you're in the virtual reality, you have sounds, sounds of culture, sounds of language, sounds of the objects themselves. And we're still building how that's going to look and feel and sound, but the idea is to bring into the virtual experience something that can't exist when you stand in front of the physical blanket. And lastly, an augmented reality project that has the capability possibly of bringing some of those digital stories and some of that digital experience to a person standing in front of the witness blanket itself, where through image recognition on their phone, and if you had your earbuds with you, you could maybe hear some of those stories. You could see behind or underneath the documents to read more of the interactions between in that chain of communication, where I was only able to put one of the documents up. And we've also built a replica blanket that at the moment is in my home community. It's like 5 blocks from my house. So it's really cool to be able to go just down the road and see something that has been traveling around. And then I did that earlier this week, and then came here to Winnipeg and spent a couple of days with the original blanket. And I guess as an artist and thinking about it from this agreement, this contract, it's particularly sort of poignant and meaningful right now, and thinking about what the possibilities become with these digital projects. Part of those digital projects are being empowered by a sponsorship agreement with TELUS. About a month ago, we made an announcement of $1 million cash and in-kind contribution where they are supporting those digital projects. And I mention this right now because when we made that sponsorship agreement, the stewardship agreement came up, and it became, it was added as a schedule or as an appendix. And the language in the sponsorship agreement refers to the stewardship agreement. When it comes to dispute resolution, when it comes to the idea of rights and ownership of the digital projects that come with it, they will be cared for under the stewardship agreement. And the witness blanket itself is a signatory to that agreement. So this is kind of how you start with one little idea, and it was maybe 1.5 years of hard work to bring that into reality. And then it kind of takes a bit of a life of its own and continues to grow. The last part of the financial component was to invest in the legacy of the witness blanket. Residential school survivors provided me an incredible opportunity and gave a gift to this world by the generosity of the money they set aside for commemoration. And I wanted for this agreement to somehow continue that work. And so I asked that the remainder, after we've paid for those other aspects, go to a legacy. And the legacy for that is going to be the Uncenter for Arts and Decolonization. And it's a place where more artists will be able to make more artwork that address the underlying injustice in this world. And we're going to set it up so that it's anti-oppressive and anti-racist and non-hierarchical in its founding principles. And we will think about community engagement in a different way, so that when we work with community in the same way I did with gathering these objects and pieces, that we think differently about who owns that material and who profits from that knowledge and how that knowledge is carried forward and who is credited for it in authorship. And so, again, this agreement has little streams that run away from it that hopefully will continue to grow and continue to take on more and more of the work of decolonization. I've got some really academic words in describing what the vision for the Uncenter is. But really what I want it to do is to address the underlying causes. I think that when we think about patriarchy, when we think about financial and climate injustice and growing wealth inequality, that they trace their roots back to the same reason that we need reconciliation. Because injustice starts with colonization. A lot of these injustices trace back to unchecked capitalism. And because we don't live in good relationship with the land around us, we don't live in good relationship with technology. And by that I mean, we often take the power of technology and rather than putting it into providing more food for the hungry, we put it into providing more wealth for the wealthy. When we have the power to dig up all the coal because we have a steam engine, we just dig more of it faster instead of taking that responsibility approach to the future. I always try to put a picture of my daughter in every presentation. And here she is playing, that's an earth drum that I made. And I include it because when you play an earth drum, or one of my earth drums, it resonates because it's so big, both for everybody around. You can make music for the people, for yourself and the people you're with, but it resonates below human hearing. And it hovers above the earth, so you're standing on the ground, not concrete, not a floor, and those reverberations go down into the earth. And so it's like a passive way of encouraging people to think differently about their relationship with land. I talked a little bit about collaboration. I see the witness blanket as maybe the largest collaboration that I'll ever do. But I also think about the responsibility that comes along with that, and how you enter into collaboration and what it means to try to reduce hierarchy, what it means to try to be less colonial in the thinking, and how responsibility comes up over and over and over again. And when we think about responsibility rather than rights, how much better off we are. And that's one of the fundamental principles, I think, in this agreement. So that's the agreement. That's the hope for the future of it. Those are some of the things that are going along with it. And so I'll close in my language by saying Hemas. That is everything. Gilakasla, Haitsapka. And thank you all for listening. And I want to invite questions, and I want to invite Jennifer to come up and be part of the conversation.
I thought about a lot of things during your presentation, and I guess one thing that came to mind, one of the questions that came to mind is, as we're looking for indigenizing universities right now, universities across the country are trying to think through that. When we talk about structural change, I think one of the key messages that I hear from you is that it's the responsibility to our relationships that's key. And I'm just wondering, it's a little bit outside of what you talked about, but if we're thinking about creating structural change in post-secondary institutions, and you talked about dispute resolution, there's a lot of conflict that happens within universities, amongst staff, students, faculty, just even about decision making. I'm just wondering if there's anything through your examination of contracts and relationships with people that could speak to how we would look at resolving conflict differently in universities.
That's a great question. I think to change the way that we resolve dispute requires changing the voices that are represented at the table, and also recognizing that some of the structures that create the obstacles that lead to the dispute in the first place need to be addressed, right? Like some things, academic freedom, for instance. When I'm sitting in an EDI committee and we're talking about how to make sure that students see themselves reflected in the course material, everybody agrees that we want to see that occur. But when we talk about implementation, academic freedom gets in the way, because we can't mandate that a prof change their course material, because then we're interfering with their academic freedom. And so we have to then see that maybe academic freedom, like a lot of freedoms, can't be absolute, right? Like they have to be premised on when it comes to a question of equality, that we have to be able to question that, because it can't be sacrosanct, and both protect the thought, the freedom of thought for the faculty member, and the rights of the student. And so I think that's part of it, like, because in my experience, that's where a lot of those disputes arise, right? We have to be willing to challenge them, and that's part of the process of decolonization. I know that's not quite like exactly on in the lane of answering your question on how to resolve a dispute. But the other thing that I would say that we've learned from working together was, by focusing on responsibility rather than rights, it transforms the way that the conversation occurs. So if a person says, I have the right, instead, if you hear, maybe we all have a responsibility here, then I think that might be another way, at least in the short term, until we can start to address the larger structural things, to change conversations so they're less positional.
No, great answer, thank you. Do we have any questions on, no? Okay. Okay, we have another question.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I have a question that goes right back, I think, to the beginning of your project. Can you talk a little bit about why you called it a blanket and the whole metaphor of the blanket in this project?
Sure. I know it doesn't look like a blanket, but if you go and you're brave enough to poke it, it moves. You might get chastised because it's in the museum now. But the reason was because I wanted it to represent comfort and protection and honoring, in the same way that we use blankets on the West Coast. They are our identity. They are what we wrap around our loved ones, to honor them, to uplift them. They're also what we wrap our babies in when they're born, and they're what we wrap our loved ones in when they're moving on to another world. So that's why I wanted it to be a blanket. And I know it's not a super comfortable blanket, but it can't be, because the history is too uncomfortable. The truth is too uncomfortable. But I try to make up for that in the aesthetic of it. Not to dull the truth, but mostly actually for survivors, so that when they are confronted by it, they don't see something ugly. That they see something that's beautiful. Because I think that's what I get so clearly and so strongly in conversations with survivors, is the grace and the generosity in the way they think about the need for something like a commemoration that turned into a witness blanket. So that's why it's a blanket.
Okay, well, I just wanted to close off the session today. First of all, thanking Lorena for having us here today to present on this topic, a very important topic. And as I imagine you can understand the importance of it, this for me has been a highlight for my career thus far. I'm actually a lawyer by training as well, so it's been a super, super unique experience for me to be involved in this project. And as Carey mentioned earlier in the question that was posed, it's all about responsibility, right? And when we focus on responsibility, it really, really does shift the way we look at things. It shifts our thinking, it shifts our approach, and it really is the reason why we do things differently. So This whole thing has been based in relationships. I now am forever involved with the witness blanket because not only because of my participation on a professional level, but on a personal level. You know, Carey has become my family. He's my friend, he's become my family, he's a colleague. But again, more importantly, I have become connected in that way, and this will forever be in my heart. It's heart work, and it's something that I will remain connected to it. And ceremony, again, being the key piece to this relationship. And it's understanding, creating meaningful spaces for conversation to do things differently. If we really want to center Indigenous ways of knowing and being, we have to be very mindful of opening up that space in a good way so that we can do that. And it takes time. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources, and it takes a whole lot of patience, right, to get to that place of understanding. So, and I feel like we've established a good foundation through the work that we've been able to do through the Museum for Human Rights, and also just by introducing this concept to others, and really hoping to build on that as we go forward, because this really is just the starting point. So Chimigwach again for having us, and Chimigwach Carey for being here. So it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to where this road takes us. So, waiwene.
Likewise.